So I'm curious, just like this critique of language, Foucault-Said critique of language is one critique of language. There's also an Orwellian critique of language, which is similar in the sense that it believes language can change the world, euphemism can change the world. Totalitarian states use euphemisms to change the world, and that you can't really think clearly unless you call a spade, right? It's the kind of critique of language that would detest the phrase enhanced interrogation as opposed to torture. Can you sort of compare and contrast those two critiques of language?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts here. I mean, so first of all, just on Foucault and this form of thinking about language, this is where sort of the success of this form of politics, which actually has had a lot of impact on our world, is nearly self-validating, right? I don't think it self-validates that actually truth is subjective and so on, but clearly, one of the core postmodern critiques that a lot of the time what we think of as truth just depends on who's in which social positions and who exercises power. Actually, ironically, I've become more convinced of for the last 10 or 20 years because we've all started to believe a lot of bullshit. And the same way, there's this kind of ambivalence where Foucault inspired this attempt to reshape our social reality by insisting on these terms. And some of that is sort of fruitless. Some of this makes people engage in word salad that might work in activist spaces, but is completely irrelevant to everybody else. But some of it is actually very powerful. I think the idea that America is effectively divided between whites and people of color, and that's how to understand our elections, that's how to understand our basic social conflicts and so on, has real impacts on how the Democratic Party runs its campaigns, for example. And at some level is self-sustaining. I think the category of the Asian American, which is a completely nonsensical category if you think about the vast cultural and historical differences between India and China, has in a weird way created a reality of Asian Americans who think of themselves as standing in solidarity with each other and having commonalities, even if historically they come from very, very different groups. And at the same time, somebody like Foucault would give you the tools to criticize that, right? The idea that, America is fundamentally to be understood as a clash between whites and people of color, and everything that comes with that in our current political narrative, that is something that Foucault would have immediately recognized and criticized as a grand narrative for all of the pitfalls of grand narratives.
Right.
Now, you ask a really astute question about George Orwell. I was teaching a class about George Orwell recently, and I was really struck by the parallel between some of their insights. And in fact, one of my students wrote a very good paper on precisely the question you asked me about, the parallels between Orwell and Foucault. And Orwell, of course, got to many of these ideas a few decades before Foucault and put them in more straightforward language. But Foucault is readable in himself. He's not an easy read, but he certainly is in some ways a good stylist and somebody who's enjoyable to read. And I wonder whether Foucault read Orwell. There must be an answer to this, and Orwell was a big enough figure that probably he did. But there may have been influence from Orwell to Foucault. I'm speculating about this, but it would be interesting to know. Here's some of the core similarities. The real fear and skepticism that the way we talk about things might obscure their true nature is shared by Orwell and Foucault. And actually the core fear about social control is shared by them. If you read 1984, the telescreen is always on. It can watch you. You never know when you're being watched. And so people are punished in the society, in the dystopian society that Orwell describes it at regularity. But most of the time what makes them obey is the fear that they might be being watched because they never know whether they are or not. Well, what is one of the core fears that Michel Foucault has in Crime and in Discipline and Punish, his work on the criminal justice system.
The panopticon?
It is the panopticon. And what is a panopticon? It is a sort of solution suggested, designed by James Mill, in which the prison guard stands in a watchtower in the middle of a space, and the cells are arranged in a hemisphere around him. And so if you're a prisoner, you never know if you're being watched right now or not. And so, yes, you might be punished for infractions, but most of the time you self-discipline and anticipatory obedience of possible punishment, of possible observation. So again, real similarity there between what Orwell and what Foucault fear. And by the way, I would argue that today, this is part of what would make both Orwell and Foucault critics of, for lack of a better term, cancel culture, critics of the kind of way in which on platforms like Twitter, we punish each other for transgressions. We never know where the line is that might get you punished. Even a like of a tweet might be crossing the line. And so you're continually worried about, you're continually second-guessing yourself, what might get you in trouble. And so better stay very far away from the line in an act of anticipatory obedience. Mm-hmm. I think both Orwell would think of that as a strange form of a telescreen. Foucault would think of that as a strange form of digital panopticon. Mm-hmm. But they both, I think, within their own language, would end up being worried about the same thing.
Mm. So is it fair to say that maybe a core difference between them is that Orwell believed in the possibility of real moral progress and Foucault was skeptical of that?
Yes.
In other words, like
right.
Orwell thought that when you stripped away the euphemism, the totalitarian euphemism, and called a spade, and you had a chance of actually improving society, and that was an important thing to do. And Foucault was just waiting for the new kind of oppression at the end of that process, right?